to dialogue. Relations between China and the U.S. are a key force shaping the global pattern, so it's vital to acknowledge and better understand the relationship. Many people would like to know, will the two largest economies be more confrontational, and how can they avoid harmful miscalculation? To discuss these issues and more, I'm joined by David Firestein, President and Chief Executive Officer of the George H.W. Bush Foundation for U.S.China Relations. That's our topic. I'm Zhou Yue. You've said that the policy makers in Biden administration don't regard China as the enemy of the U.S. But looking at what the Biden administration has been doing and saying, it seems they're trying to undermine China's abilities and international standings over the past half a year. How can that not be what you treat an enemy?
I think it is true that there is a subtle but significant difference in the way that the Biden administration looks at China if we compare it to the way that the Trump administration looked at China. And I do think there were some very prominent voices within the Trump administration who clearly thought of China as the enemy of the United States. And one thing that we've seen in the early months of the Biden administration is that the president himself, as well as the Secretary of State and other senior leaders and officials, have made it clear that they reject that particular framing, but rather that they look at China as the most formidable competitor to the United States that there is in the world, and that we need to compete with China more effectively than we have been, but that we should not regard China as an enemy or adversary per se. And I think that distinction, although it is subtle and sometimes easy to lose sight of, is meaningful. And I think it's encouraging that there is a more pragmatic and less ideological approach on the part of the Biden administration toward China. But it is true that a lot of the policies in their substance look very similar to those of the Trump administration. And so the point that I would make is that I think rhetorically, there is a meaningful difference that we shouldn't lose sight of.
But the question is Biden pragmatic indeed? Because Biden didn't revoke the tariffs on China's imports. He continued to search for the origin of the COVID as probably insinuating that China is the culprit. It seems that everything Biden does is a repeat of Trump.
Well, to a large degree, it is true that the Biden administration's approach to China right now is pretty indistinguishable from that of the Trump administration if you look at the bottom line policies, though there has been a change in the rhetoric. And one thing I would note is, particularly with respect to the question of COVID-19, there has been a really dramatic change in the way that the President of the United States speaks about this issue compared to his predecessor. President Trump used a lot of very ugly and reprehensible, racially charged and even racist language that I think and many Americans would regard as beneath the dignity of the presidency of the United States. And Joe Biden doesn't speak that way about COVID-19. And so I think we see some of the tonality changing around that particular issue. But it is certainly true that a lot of the policies look very similar to those that we had under Trump. You're exactly right when you say that the tariffs continue. And as you may know, I have been very, very critical of the notion of tariffs and specifically the U.S. tariffs on Chinese imports because they've hurt America very badly. And the data shows that very clearly. I think both sides should get rid of the tariffs because it's bad for both sides. And I think over time, in my judgment, President Biden and the Biden administration will start to move in that direction because during the campaign, Joe Biden and Kamala Harris were both on the record as being critical of the Trump tariffs precisely for the reasons that I am, namely that they are very harmful to the United States economy. But the last thing I'll say is the politics of China in the United States today are such that this administration clearly doesn't feel that it can do anything that could be perceived or characterized as being unduly, quote, friendly to China, and therefore they're hemmed in by the politics. But I think the difference that's really important is that the Biden administration understands that some of these policies are not good for America, and I think they'll change them over time.
Obviously, there is some lack of confidence on both sides. So, to what extent do you blame the American politics, the Chinese politics, the rising power, and the economic strengths of China? What is the major reasons behind this lack of confidence?
Well, I have said, and I do believe that the stark deterioration that we've seen in the U.S.-China relationship over the last several years is the result of actions on both sides. And I think both the United States and China, in different ways, bear significant responsibility jointly and separately for what has happened in the relationship. Certainly, some of the rhetorical excesses on the United States side, particularly regarding COVID-19, to which I alluded earlier, as well as other areas, have contributed to that. I think certain Chinese actions and at times rhetorical comments have also contributed to that negative spiral or downward spiral in the relationship. And I think from a U.S. perspective, fundamentally, the problem that the United States has with China, to summarize it in one very basic theme, is the idea of reciprocity and the lack of, certainly the perceived, and I think the real lack of reciprocity in the U.S.-China relationship, and specifically in the U.S.-China trade and commercial relationship. And I think there is a real desire on the part of the United States to see a more equal and symmetrical and reciprocal relationship where markets are opened on both sides to the same degree. And on the Chinese side, I certainly can understand why many in China look at recent U.S. rhetoric in particular and U.S. actions and feel a sense that the United States is out to get China. I don't think that's an unjustified feeling when looking at the totality of what the United States has said and done relative to China over the last 4 years. So I think there are roots and causes on both sides, and I think both sides have to step up to address them to try to get this relationship back to the right place.
Hey, Mr. Firestein, you are a China expert and you know Taiwan issue very well. But it seems from the perspective of the Chinese and the Americans have the impulse to use the Taiwan issue as a leverage against mainland China. Trump did some very unconventional things on Taiwan. Biden also sent his high-ranking officials to Taiwan. And as a result, the Chinese mainland is also stepping up its surveillance and reconnaissance efforts across the Taiwan Strait. Do you think it will become a flashpoint between the two countries?
Well, first of all, I agree with your characterizations, and I think you've very rightly summarized what's happened in terms of Taiwan. I don't think it's going to become a flashpoint if by the term flashpoint we mean, do I think there will be military conflagration across the Taiwan Strait? No, I don't think that's going to happen for a number of reasons, but mainly because I don't think anyone is going to regard the benefits of engaging in military confrontation across the strait as outweighing the costs. And as long as that is true, I don't think we're going to see conflagration or outright military conflict across the strait. And in that regard, I don't think we're going to see the cross-strait sort of picture turn into a flashpoint per se. But it is absolutely true, as you've rightly noted, that the tensions across the strait have increased greatly in recent years for reasons on both sides. I think it is true and fair to say that the United States is, in a sense, using Taiwan to some degree as a lever in its toolkit relative to expressing displeasure with China or sending signals to China. And of course, there is a substantive and self-standing relationship, not an official relationship, but a relationship there that also is driving a lot of that. And on the other side of the equation, as you've noted, China has stepped up its reconnaissance and surveillance and has put a lot of airplanes into what Taiwan would regard as its, quote, air defense identification zone, unquote. And so there is a lot going on, but I know there is tension, but I think the tension can be managed by the two sides, and I certainly hope that happens.
A larger backdrop between China-America relationship is, of course, the people's perception about each other. The images of China and the U.S. as portrayed in the media in the two countries have vastly been going downward. Negative views have risen, especially during the pandemic. So what do you think need to happen for us to have a more nuanced, a more balanced view about each other?
Well, it's going to be difficult because I think what you've said is exactly right. There's been a really stark deterioration in U.S. public sentiment toward China. We now are officially at the low water mark in terms of public favorable views toward China in the United States. And quite frankly, just COVID-19 over the last nearly year and a half has been a big driver in the United States of this deterioration in U.S. favorable sentiment toward China. I'm very well aware that Chinese sentiment toward the United States has also deteriorated, and I can certainly understand why that is so as well. So, I think leadership matters, and I think the words of our national leaders and our spokespersons in our agencies, such as ministries of foreign affairs and the State Department and so on, can set a tone. I think the tone that we see being set out of Washington is somewhat improved, I wouldn't overstate it, but it is a little better than what we saw coming out of the Trump administration. I hope we'll see, and I believe we will see reciprocation of that on the Chinese side. But the bottom line is, I think the people need to engage each other. Our business communities need to engage each other. And as we address some of the real challenges and policy issues in the relationship and get hopefully progress or resolution on some of them, that's where we will see this relationship get back to where it should be. But it's going to take some time, and I don't think there's a silver bullet for it.
But Mr. Firestein, probably you've noticed to demonize and demoralize China has become the political norm in the United States politics. And then anything short of criticizing China is regarded as unacceptable in America.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. There's no question about it. Demonizing China is kind of the new national pastime in the United States of America. There's no question about it. It's seeped across the partisan aisle. It started out as mostly Republican. It's certainly now pretty bipartisan, although I think it's more Republican than Democratic. And there's no question that there is a huge amount of negativity toward China. As I've often said, if to use a metaphor, if China were helping an elderly grandmother across the street to cross the street safely, many in America would find fault in that. No matter what China does, it's wrong in the eyes of many, many Americans. And I think that approach, that mindset and reflexive response to China is not helping America. I think it's causing us to miss some important nuance. And I hope that our nation can get back to a less ideological and more fact-based and more pragmatic way of looking at China. Some of the things China does are very problematic for the United States. And by the way, some of the things that America does are very problematic for China. So let's look at the facts, and on the basis of facts, let's try to solve problems rather than just merely hurling demonizing statements at each other, because that doesn't solve anybody's problems.
But unfortunately, you are the minority now in your country.
Yes, that's true. And quite frankly, I take a lot of hits for it. Listen, my North Star is President George H.W. Bush. As President and CEO of the George H.W. Bush Foundation for U.S.-China Relations, we ascribe to President George H.W. Bush's views on the relationship. And he believed that the U.S.-China relationship was the most important bilateral relationship in the world, and that no global challenge could be enduringly resolved in the absence of bringing the United States and China together. That used to be a mainstream view in this country. It's not anymore, and I am in the minority, but we're going to continue to stand strong for what we believe in and for what President George H.W. Bush stood for, because I think those are the right ideas for America.
And Mr. Firestein, what is more worrying is that it seems that Biden wants to use ideology as a wedge, because ideology has been now prioritized in dealing with China. Because from the Chinese perspective, we never want to export our ideology to America, but it seems Biden framed this as a battle between democracy and autocracy, which is quite unacceptable here.
Well, I think your characterization is correct. There's no question that President Biden has laid out a framework in which it is kind of a democracy versus autocracy framing, as you've rightly noted. I do think there is a pretty broad misunderstanding in the United States and in Washington as to what China's aspirations are. I don't think that China seeks to export its system to others, not to the United States, not to others. I think China wants to make the world safe, not for its system, but safe for itself. It wants to exist and it wants to not take orders or directives from any other country in the world. That's what China wants, and it's going to continue down whatever path it believes will get it to that objective. But I don't think China seeks to proactively go out into the world and topple democracies or create, quote, authoritarian regimes that are replicas of China's system in country A or country B. I think that's a misreading of China's intentions. And I think we have a couple of pretty fundamental misreadings of China's intentions in this country, which have become widely accepted, but which are not accurate. And they're taking our country, the United States of America, down a path that I think is not getting the United States to where it wants to get to, because we're fundamentally predicating our policy in inaccurate assumptions.
I know for years there have been a mechanism of U.S.-China political party leaders' high-level meetings, which delegations of U.S. Democratic Party and Republican Party leaders and the Chinese Communist Party senior officials attended. Do you think that mechanism is still afloat, and how can Democrats and Republicans evolve their views on CPC and China's growth?
Well, it's a great question. And I think that the need for political dialogue between our two countries, that is to say, dialogue that focuses on politics, not just on policy, is really important, particularly at this moment in time, because certainly in the United States, the biggest impediment to the improvement of relations between the United States and China is the politics of China in America. And to a certain degree, and within the context of a very different kind of system, the politics of America and China are also a significant factor in the way that China comes at the United States. So I think having political leaders representing the two major parties of the United States and certainly the Communist Party of China makes a lot of sense. It makes sense for them to come together to talk about these issues, to talk about politics, to be open and candid and honest, to share concerns, to share disagreements, to share fears, and also to share a vision for where we may be able to work together. That's probably never been more important than it is now. And so I do think a political track, not just a policy track, but a political track in US-China engagement that is distinct from governmental engagement and that allows private folks on the US side to come together with party folks on the Chinese side and talk about these issues. I think that's really value adding at this particular moment in the history of the US-China relationship.
And this year marks the 100th anniversary of the CPC. I know that probably in the American media and political circle, they usually characterize the CPC not as a very progressive political institution, but what are your observations of its track record, its governance, its achievement?
Well, I think there's no serious and intellectually honest observer can dispute the fact that over the last 100 years, the transformation that has occurred in China has been astounding. I mean, from the standpoint of where the economy has come from and where it is now, where Chinese society was in 1921 and where it is today in 2021, the level of material comfort of the average Chinese citizen, by any metric in terms of the economy and in terms of Chinese society, there's no question but that there has been an incredible transformation over these last 100 years. And I think that is self-evident to anyone who understands today's China and who has spent time in China in recent years. I think it's also true that the party itself, the Communist Party of China itself, has been transformed in certain ways as well. It initially was a Marxist-Leninist party that embraced Mao Zedong thought and that was essentially a revolutionary party by definition. But now it is a political party that embraces, in many ways, modern economic thought, modern trading practices, free market principles, certainly to a significant degree. And it's a very different party than the party of 1921 or the party of 1951. And so the party itself, I think, is very different today. And one thing that it's shown that it is capable of doing is adapting to changes in the world and in China. and being flexible and being nimble. And I think that the leadership of the Communist Party of China no doubt looks to the future with a great sense of confidence. And for my part, I certainly would hope that the Communist Party will continue to embrace reform and opening and progress and good governance at home and peace and development abroad. And I think those are all objectives that I think would serve China well.
And the CPC probably has been very consistent in its U.S. policies, dealing with both Democrats and Republicans in the U.S. That is a realistic and pragmatic way. But on the other hand, it seems the U.S. politicians have been more unpredictable in its relationship, in its policies towards China. Am I correct?
I think there has been in the last 4 years or so, since 2017, there has been a change in the United States in how certainly official Washington, both within the executive branch and the legislative branch, look at the Communist Party of China and look at China generally. The narrative is very different. The mindset is very different. There's much more of a sense of kind of existential competition, although the roots of that really go back probably 12 years or more, certainly to 2010, if not even a couple of years earlier than that. But it's become much more pronounced. And I do think that there is, in some ways, a greater degree of ideological content in the way that the United States looks at China than arguably the way that China looks at the United States today. And I do think that both sides would be well served by looking at each other pragmatically and in a way that focuses on how do we solve problems and make people's lives better. And if we do that, I think we will find that there are areas where we need to work together, not because it's altruistic or charitable toward the other side, but because it's good for each of our countries, it's good for the region, and it's good for the world. And that's the mindset that I hope that we see going forward. But it's going to take a while to get there.
One thing that can make both our lives better is economic cooperation. Well, many believe now it is unrealistic that China and the United States can avoid decoupling. That means economic decoupling, technological decoupling. What do you say?
Well, it's a debatable question, and there's a lot of discussion about it in the United States. At one level, it would seem that it is extremely unlikely that countries as large and consequential as the United States and China, and that are as integrated economically as the United States and China, could realistically decouple. But on the other hand, there is a tendency in that direction in certain areas, whether it's with respect to telecommunications infrastructure or I would say an increasing number of kind of high-tech or sensitive technology areas. So I think we have to recognize that, unfortunately, it is possible for the United States and China and, if you will, as we might put it, the US and Chinese camps more broadly, to disengage from each other in terms of technology and in terms of technological platforms, telecommunications platforms, and so on. And I think that would be a really bad outcome for the world. It bucks the trend that we've seen over the last several decades, where there's a kind of convergence toward, I think, what's sometimes termed singularity, or the notion that we're all moving in the same direction and getting onto the same platforms. I think everyone would agree that from an economic standpoint, that is a desirable thing to do. And I think we see some countervailing thinking about that in the United States and in certain other countries in the world. So what I would say to your question is, I don't think there is a foreordained outcome. I think that we, the people of the world, are going to have to choose the outcome that we want and then work hard to realize that outcome. And I think it could go either way. It's not going to be easy to decouple, but unfortunately, to a certain degree, I think it's possible that that may occur. And I, for my part, hope that we don't see that outcome, because I think it would be bad for everyone.
And let's also talk about the competitive part of the economic relations. Recently, the Congress passed the Innovation and Competition Act. That seems to suggest that America is doing its own version of industrial policy, which the America has been criticizing China for doing over the past decades. What is happening?
Well, first of all, I think you're right. The United States has, I think, come to the conclusion over the last several years that there may actually be some value to industrial policy. And that, as you rightly note, has not been the US approach historically. It was not the approach that really made the United States the number one economy in the history of the world and the number one innovator in the world. But I think there is a sense that China has had success with this policy, with the notion of industrial policy, and that maybe, to use the vernacular phrase in the United States, if we can't beat them, join them. So if we can't outperform China using, this is a perception, I'm not saying it's necessarily the reality, but the perception in Washington is if we can't beat China doing what we've historically done, then maybe we need to adopt some tricks from the Chinese playbook. And I think we are seeing a movement toward industrial policy. We are seeing a movement in the United States away from the construct of comparative advantage, which I think is very problematic. We're getting away from free trade to a certain degree. We're getting away from the notion of globalization as a good thing. And we're moving away from classical American political economic thinking and economic and trade thinking. And I'm very skeptical that that's a good idea for the United States. But I will say this, in terms of the legislation that is moving through Congress now, a lot of it I think is appropriate in the sense of basically being designed to up our own game, to increase America's ability to compete, to research, to develop, to continue to have strength in these important technological areas. And I think all of that is very appropriate and smart policy for America. But I think we also just need to make sure that we don't abandon the ideas of the free market and free trade and globalization, because those are the ideas that made our country the economic superpower that it is, and it would be unwise to cast away those ideas at this time.
And interestingly, that industrial policy is not the only thing Biden is copying from China. He's also copying Belt and Road Initiative. They come up with a Build Back the Road plan. What do you think of that plan?
Well, you're right. I mean, look, there is a lot of copying right now in the United States of Chinese practices. I've often said that, I've been critical of certain Chinese trade and economic practices in the past and other practices as well. And I've said that what we see now is that the United States is adopting what I would regard as some of China's worst practices as best practices to be adopted. And of course, it contravenes the things that we've stood for many decades. And you're right when you say that we're now doing a lot of the things in the United States that we have long criticized China for doing when China did them. And I think that undermines our credibility as a nation. But you're right, we now see a US response to the Belt and Road Initiative. I think that's fine, but it's interesting that it's taken all these years for the United States to get to this point. We see US responses to industrial policy and trade practices. There's a whole range of things that we're doing now where our basic mantra seems to be, let's take plays out of the Chinese playbook.
I think the Chinese have no problems, Americans copying us. Just do it as a big person, not a small person.
Well, it's interesting to see that some of the dynamics have changed in terms of how the United States looks at some of these things, and the fact that we're emulating some of these initiatives is a very interesting development in the relationship.
All right. Thank you very much, Mr. Firestein, for your insightful talks with me. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's an honor to be with you.